welcome everybody to this evening's debate on shareholder and stakeholder capitalism. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Patrick Fay. I'm one of the co-presidents of the MISSOC Sloan chapter, and helping me host tonight is J.R. Scott, who is my co-president over there. So a quick intro on the Adam Smith Society mission to promote debate and discussion surrounding the moral, social, and economic benefits of capitalism. And if you're worried that it was going to end with business school, there is a professional aspect to SmithSoc as well. So please feel free to continue on the journey after you graduate. So a quick introduction on the rules here. We'll have each speaker with 5 minutes for opening comments, staggered by questions from myself and JR for the next 30 minutes. And we'll have an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the discussion. Please hold our questions to the end. And at the end as well, we'll have a bit of a student mixer / sort of post sort of debate discussion for anyone who would like to stay on for another 15 to 20 minutes following tonight's event. Also, please email us if you would like a free copy of Vivek's book. If you're a Sloan chapter member, just email myself or JR. And if you're with another school, please email your school's chapter president. All right. And I will send it off to JR to introduce the topic of tonight's discussion.
Well, thanks, Patrick. So as you can see behind Patrick, the title of tonight's debate is Woke Capitalism a Threat to Democracy? I think we have two of the best qualified people in the world to actually speak on this topic tonight. So I'll introduce both of them briefly. I guess I'll go alphabetically. So Vivek Ramaswamy is a New York Times bestselling author and a successful entrepreneur who has founded multiple successful enterprises. He's a first-generation American and the founder and executive chairman of Roivant Sciences, a new type of biopharmaceutical company focused on the application of technology to drug development. He founded Roivant in 2014 and led the largest biotech IPOs of 2015 and 2016. So MBA students on the call will be excited about that. Vivek graduated summa cum laude in biology from Harvard in 2007 and began his career as a successful biotech investor and at a prominent hedge fund. He's continued to work as an investor while earning his law degree at Yale. Vivek has authored numerous articles and op-eds, which have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, National Review, Newsweek, and Harvard Business Review. He also serves on the boards of directors of the Philanthropy Roundtable, the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, and St. Xavier High School. And of course, Luigi Zingales, who is the Robert C. McCormick Distinguished Service Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Luigi's research interests span from corporate governance to financial development, from political economy to the economic effects of culture. He's published extensively in the major economic and financial journals. I'm a PhD student in finance, so I'm very familiar with a lot of Luigi's research. He's also written 2 best-selling books, which is rare for an academic. The first one, Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists, was released in 2003. That was joint with Raghu Rajan. And A Capitalism for the People was released in 2012. Luigi is also the faculty director of the Stigler Center for the Study of the Economy and State. And as I think we've already alluded to, many of you know Luigi as the co-host of the podcast Capital Isn't with Bethany McLean. So to kind of start things off here, I'd like to invite Vivek to speak for about 5 minutes. So again, the topic is woke capitalism a threat to democracy? Very much related to the thesis of your book. So we're wondering if you could, as briefly as you can, and we'll explore this topic further, kind of give your take. What is woke capitalism? Why do you think it's such a threat to democracy as you kind of presented in Woke Incorporated? And then we'll get Luigi's take afterwards.
Yeah, sounds good. So since I know we have a long discussion ahead, I'll actually save more of the argument for later and upfront just state some definitions, or at least parse some distinctions that I think could help the discussion that I hope we're about to have. So stakeholder capitalism refers to the idea that corporations ought to not only serve their shareholders' interests, but also advance other societal interests as well, including advancing other social goals. Today, this includes other social goals that range from fighting climate change to battling racism or the legacy of racism in the United States. And woke capitalism really is just a shorthand term that refers to the modern or postmodern progressive values that happen to be the social values that many corporations have adopted, particularly as it relates to racial and gender identity. Now, I make the case in my book that this represents a threat to democracy, which in many ways is the inverse of the argument that Milton Friedman made 50 years ago. Like me, Milton Friedman believed that stakeholder capitalism was a bad idea, but he believed it was a bad idea for a different reason, principally at least. He felt that the expansion of politics into the sphere of business was likely to be detrimental to business, was likely to make businesses operate less effectively and be less profitable in a way that then reduced the overall size of the economic pie that society was able to benefit from as a consequence. I'm actually sympathetic to many of the arguments that he made, and I make some of those arguments in my book too, but the core argument that I make is actually the inverse argument, which is not that politics risks infecting private enterprise, but actually my concern about the way in which the expansion of the role of private enterprise risks infecting the integrity of our politics in a democracy. And the reason I say that is that stakeholder capitalism ultimately demands then that the people who hold market power, the small group of corporate elites, CEOs, investors, and so forth, wield not only power in the marketplace of products, but also power in the marketplace of ideas. And to me, that was a betrayal of the fundamental promise of American democracy, of the American system, in contrast to that of the old world European model, where a small group of church leaders, labor elites, and business leaders got together and decided the common good for the rest of society. The American model was built on the idea that we decide our most important political and normative questions. We determine the answers and settle the answers to those disputes through free speech and open debate in the public square, where everyone's voice and vote is weighted equally. And I believe what stakeholder capitalism risks doing is converting that one person, one voice, that one person, one vote system implicitly into a $1 one vote system by rewarding the people who wield market power to also give them what I view as undue influence in the marketplace of ideas. Now, this was received when I wrote the book as a somewhat conservative idea, in part because it was in response to the apparently progressive values that many business leaders are pushing today. I found that to be a bit of a curiosity because for many years, actually, the idea of being skeptical of the expansion of corporate power to wield power in the marketplace of ideas or in our politics was actually a liberal idea. In fact, this is why many liberals oppose the Supreme Court's holding in Citizens United versus FEC, which held that corporations were permitted to make electoral contributions that could influence which candidates ultimately got elected. To me, stakeholder capitalism is really Citizens United on steroids because it not only permits corporations to be able to influence democracy through the front door by way of campaign contributions, but it demands that they influence the essence of democracy, the questions that democracy ought to resolve, by instead relegating those decisions to a small group of people who wield market power without the backstop of political accountability. This is my principal concern in the book, and I'm happy to expound on it a little further. In the last couple of minutes before I wrap on the opening statement, though, I do think it's important to parse right out of the gate that when we talk about stakeholder capitalism or woke capitalism, we shouldn't talk about it as in aggregate. I think we should parse at least one of three phenomena that this refers to. The first is that of the so-called woke executive, okay, the stakeholder-centric executive. I'll use those terms interchangeably going forward. The woke executive is the executive who ultimately uses his seat of corporate power to be able to foist his values onto his employees or his other stakeholders or society at large because he happens to hold the seat of power in his role as a CEO. Here, the arguable victim is the shareholder's resources who are being misappropriated to advance a personal CEO, a manager, an agent's goals for his own personal agenda. Everyone would agree that if you're the CEO of a public company, you can't make a multi-million-dollar donation to your high school or to your, let's just say your temple where you worship. Yet last year, you saw many CEOs making a multi-million-dollar donation to what I view as a different temple, let's call it Black Lives Matter, and yet that was celebrated. Here, you could actually argue the victims were the shareholders whose resources were used to subsidize a particular social cause. That's completely different from the phenomenon that we're now seeing arise in the asset management world of the so-called ESG movement or the ESG-informed capital allocation movement, which says that actually, no, we, the investors, demand that you, the CEO, advance certain social causes, or else that would be a condition for divestment, or it will be a condition for even preventing you from listing on a public exchange. As you see based on NASDAQ's recent adoption of quota systems on a board of directors as a condition for being able to list on the NASDAQ based on race and gender and so forth. This is, let's put the NASDAQ issue to one side. This is what BlackRock and other ESG-centric investors are pushing today. Here, the shareholder isn't the victim. The shareholder is arguably the perpetrator, if you view this as a problem. The shareholder is actually the driver of the issue, and the executives are merely doing what they're told by the investors. Both of those are top-down forms of stakeholder capitalism, which are distinct still from the third phenomenon of the woke consumer. And I think that this is something that gets the short shift in discussion sometimes. The ways in which actually stakeholder capitalism or woke capitalism is a product of a bottom-up grassroots movement, every bit as much as it is a top-down product. And here, the real answer is the fact that consumers are demanding that corporations match their values, that they want to buy products from corporations whose values align with their own. And you could argue that here, executives and investors alike are just giving the market what the market demands, which is ultimately a signal of the kinds of virtues that consumers demand that corporations exhibit as a condition for buying products, which makes it the profit maximizing thing to do, both for the investor and for the executive, to ultimately cater to that consumer demand. Now, this is a problem of a different kind, if you ask me. I talk about it extensively in the book. I think it is a symptom of a deeper cultural void in the minds and hearts of an entire generation, people my age and younger, people your age and younger, who hunger for a deeper sense of purpose and identity and meaning that we have been unable to fulfill with the kinds of things that used to fulfill that moral hunger in generations past, filling it with the equivalent of fast food, going to Ben and Jerry's and ordering a cup of ice cream with a cup of morality on the side, without realizing that that's not how actually virtue and morality really work, that we actually hunger for more substantial fare. And I think that's actually probably the most, of the conversations we could have, probably the most important conversation that we could have is the one that discusses how we may fill that moral hunger of an entire generation with something more meaningful than the skin deep social causes espoused by corporate America today. I think these are three different problems which have three very different origin stories that have three very different solutions if you are somebody who views each of these as problems. But I think that somehow in many of the discussions I've had, they're conflated under one banner of stakeholder or woke capitalism, when in fact there are three very different things going on. And I hope in the discussion that we have, we're able to not only parse those distinctions, but discuss some of the responses to each of those breeds of the woke capitalist trend. So with that, that's my opening set of remarks. And I really look forward to what Luigi has to say and the rich discussion that follows with all of you, hopefully with some questions to top it off.
Well, thank you, Vivek. So Luigi, you recently actually edited an ebook for the Stickler Center that was commemorating the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's 1970 New York Times Book Review essay on shareholder capitalism. What do you make of Vivek's argument about woke capitalism, and where do you kind of see it? Do you see it as an additional nuance of the stakeholder-shareholder debate? What's your overall assessment?
I think that, first of all, I enjoy very much reading the Woke book written by Vivek. It's very well written and very interesting and with a lot of original ideas. And people who know me know that I don't make faint praise if I don't believe them. So I really mean it. And I think that I find in particular this sort of jujitsu move of Milton Friedman original idea very clever, because I think that one of the criticisms that many people have of the traditional approach is precisely the fact that it doesn't consider very much the political power of corporations, and I think Vivek does the other way around. So there is something definitely there. And I'm very sympathetic about the fact that corporations could be a threat to democracy. But let me try to parse things out a bit, because I have the impression, reading his book, that he's a very shrewd lawyer, and that all the lawyers, they tend to go a little bit too fast in the argument in order to convince the jury. And I want to sort of slow down and go maybe with the pedantic fashion of old-fashioned academics on the argument. So let me first give you the bottom line, and then I want to go in detail. So do I believe that if Chuck E. Cheese, and I use Chuck E. Cheese as an example of a small company in America, if Chuck E. Cheese issue a statement for George Floyd, is really threatening democracy? No. Do I believe that large monopolistic corporations are a threat to democracy in the United States today? Absolutely. They've been in Germany and Japan in the 30s. They've been in Latin America for the better part of the 20th century, and they are a danger in America today. Now, why they're dangerous is because they're both the motives and the opportunities to shape democratic outcomes. The motives are they really want to consolidate political power in order to make more long-lasting the profits they make. And is what I call in one of my pieces the Medici vicious circle from the Florentine family of the Medici that made its money through banking, but really continued to have power by transforming that money into power in the city of Florence. And that power led to more money, and that circle was able to be maintained for 3 centuries. So that's really what corporations are about. Now, what are the opportunities? What are the opportunities that large monopolistic corporations have that Chuck E. Cheese does not have? Number one, to distort information massively. So tobacco has misinformed us on the damage of smoking for decades. So has Exxon on the damage of global warming. So has DuPont on the toxic nature of PFOA, or Monsanto on the toxic nature of glyphosate, and so on and so forth. They capture regulation. Monsanto was, DuPont was hiring every EPA chair when they were stepping down. JP Morgan has really shaped Dodd-Frank, and you keep going. They even influence, unfortunately, academia in a major way. It's difficult to find an academic economist against Uber. I'm probably the only one who criticized Uber. And they capture the top of the administration. I think Vivek writes very well in his book how basically Goldman and the government is an integrated process. They go around back and forth from one to the other without much of a discontinuity. Now, how they are dangerous? They are dangerous in many ways. Now, Vivek describes some of them, which is the quid pro quo that you can have with the government, and I'm going to come back on that because it's an important one. And you also mentioned, of course, subsidies that are important. But I think that the major danger that I see is their ability to actually interfere with the electoral process and actually choose who are the candidates and who are not. Now, how do they deflect this dangerousness? This is where I think wokeness comes in big time. Is just a show in the very same way in which Vivek has a very funny story in his book about the ceremony of planting trees in Harlem when he was an intern at Goldman. That wasn't just a show-off, okay? And was a publicity stunt that didn't particularly change Harlem, but was good for PR. And I see the point that Vivek raised, which I think is an important point, is that this wokeness must be read as, by and large, a massive amount of PR that is a distraction element, very important. And actually, if you look under the hood, it's enough that you read the management discussion of compensation philosophy in the proxy statement. They have all this great statement about what they're going to do. But then when they show how they pay people, even in 2018-19, only less than 2% of their pay was compensated on anything other than financial measures. Okay, so there's a big emphasis on, oh, I wanted this, I wanted that. If I am Jamie Dimon, I kneel in order to show how woke I am. But then when it comes to how I pay myself and my subordinates, I think that I don't change anything. And it seems that wokeness is a bit like the donations that oil companies give to the communities where they extract the oil from. And it's very well known in the industry that those donations are basically an insurance policy. You buy a little bit of gratitude, because you know that sooner or later you're going to have an oil spill, and you want to call all your chips, all your favor when the oil spills come. And that's basically what wokeness is about. Now, is the danger wokeness? I think that the danger is sort of much more what is behind, not the wokeness itself. I regard this more a farce than a danger. On one point, I agree 100% with Vivek, and I'm very intrigued by his solution, is the danger that basically corporate America, but in particularly the government, co-opt the large media company, and particularly Facebook and Twitter, to do for the government what the government cannot do directly under the Constitution of the United States. So to have a quid pro quo in which, if I'm Facebook, I say, look, you let me be a monopolist as I am today. In exchange, I'm going to do the censorship you want me to do, and you cannot do it on your own. That, to me, is the worst danger of all, because we get screwed twice. We get screwed because there is a monopoly that is terrible, but even more so because we have reintroduced a censorship that is not possible under the Constitution, but is possible under this arrangement. Now, this is where my knowledge ends, because I'm not a lawyer, unlike Vivek. I've not been trained in law here in this country, and so I remit to him. I found this idea that you can actually sue the corporation for basically accomplishing something that is illegal under the Constitution. I don't know whether there is any legal basis, but if there is, I'm very happy to see, or look forward to see, Vivek bring in this suit. And if you want me to write an amicus brief to the extent I can, I'm there, number one.
So thank you for that, I think introduction. And if I may respond to a couple of those points before we sort of get into the moderated discussion. The thing I'll say at the outset is I, as you probably inferred from Luigi's comments, agree with over 80% of what he said, because he basically said he agreed with over 80% of what I said in the book. So that part's not a surprise. But what I will do is I'll sort of put a magnifying lens on a couple of the areas where we may have a shade of difference between us that I think is worth examining. I share his belief that the biggest and most offensive form of this crony capitalism 2.0 in the veneer of stakeholder capitalism is when government is able to use private companies to be able to do through the back door what government cannot do directly through the front door under the Constitution. I think that is what we're seeing with big tech censorship. I think that's what we're seeing with the effectuation of the climate pledge, where John Kerry, the climate czar of the United States, leans on banks to sign up to a climate pledge that they could not pass directly through Congress under the Green New Deal. There's a countless list of examples, that some of which I list in the book, that fit that description of sort of the top of the list of the hierarchy of offenses. Lower down on that list, but still high for me, is the use of concentrated corporate power, monopoly or quasi-monopolistic power, to wield undue influence in the marketplace of ideas by forcing certain ideas down the throats of the American people at large, in part merged with state power, but in part just merged with concentrated corporate power of a kind that really reflects a monopoly on ideas more so than a monopoly on products. But the real consequence for a consumer isn't necessarily being stuffed with a low price or reduced consumer choice in the case of, for example, large technology companies today, but rather a lack of choice in the marketplace of ideas that they're able to express. So that's yet a further point of agreement. Here's where I depart a little bit from Luigi, though, is that I don't think it's just the confluence of corporate power and state power that represents a threat, though that's at the top of my list. Nor do I think that it is just a matter of concentrated corporate power that presents a threat to democracy. I think even in an infinitesimally small way, but in a non-zero way, even the Chuck E. Cheese example represents a threat to democracy too. It's just smaller in scale, adjusted for the absence of market power that Chuck E. Cheese wields in the marketplace for foods that, say, Facebook wields in the marketplace of social media. And I'll tell you why. I think it is a contribution to a newly nascent form of cultural intolerance that corporate America has perpetuated. And to me, the best measure of the health of any democracy isn't actually the number of ballots that are cast every November. That's just the final act that consummates the process. To me, I'll give you, I have a longer version of this, but a short version of this is I'll give you two indices of what I think mark the health of any democracy. The first is the percentage of people who feel free to express what they actually believe in public. And right now, I think there's no doubt that we're doing abysmally on that metric. There's some data to support it. There's actually a Cato Institute survey that included Republicans, Democrats, and independents earlier this year, which said that over 60% of Americans today are afraid of expressing their true beliefs in public because of the current political environment. To me, that is a litmus test for a democracy that is dying at its heart. No matter how many ballots are cast at the end of the day, the heart and the culture of a democracy is all about the experience of freedom to be able to express yourself freely without having to worry about putting food on the dinner table, say being fired in the workplace for saying the wrong thing, as a Virginia shipyard worker was last year for wearing the hat of the wrong presidential candidate to work, or for James Damore at Google, who in a company in the guise of fostering an open exchange in the marketplace of ideas, actually fired an employee who, in my controversial opinion, had nothing particularly objectionable to say, but nonetheless was fired by accepting a company's invitation to express his ideas. So to me, I think that that's not directly related to how much power Google wields or how much power that Virginia shipyard worker, the shipyard company wields in its respective market. That's an incremental threat. That's a non-zero threat to the integrity of a democracy, no matter how much market power that company wields. It's just all the worse when it's magnified through market power in a concentrated way. And I think that that's the second litmus test of a democracy that I wanted to offer is a true democracy or a democratic republic or a democratically formed free society is one that settles its political questions through free speech and open debate rather than through the use of force. And I think that whether it's stakeholder capitalism on a small scale or stakeholder capitalism on a large scale, I think what stakeholder capitalism demands is that the people who ultimately wield the control over our dollars in the marketplace also are able to wield undue influence in the ideas that are politically most important and ultimately prevail in the way that we go about living our lives, be it the decisions that BlackRock makes as its condition for investment in a newly public company, or be it even Chuck E. Cheese determining what standards or sort of oaths of fealty you must adopt to their DEI agenda as a condition of ultimately working there. So that's why I think both represent, even the smallest forms still represent a threat to democracy. They're just smaller threats because the agents perpetrating those threats happen to wield less power.
But I think that that conflicts a bit on the freedom to be different in this country. So if I'm Chick-fil-A and I want to close down on Sunday because I want my workers to close down on Sunday, you can say that this is very coercive because some workers would like to work on Sunday and they don't give the opportunity, but they choose not to give on Sunday. If I am a Jewish organization and I don't want to serve German people because of the history that it is, I think that, or I'm a bookstore and I don't want to carry certain kind of books because they are offensive to me. I think that the beauty of the marketplace, the beauty of competition is that I can do that and everybody else can be served by somebody else. So in a competitive market, I think we have freedom of choice. Is when the market is not competitive, where people have market power, then my choices become very consequential for everybody else. And that's where I am with you. You have to be careful because you exercise coercion.
Yeah, so I think I want to respond to that point. I think it's a really important one. In that this is where I approach this not as an academic, but as a practitioner or somebody who has at least lived in the real world of corporate America and responds less to the theory of the way the market ought to work and the way the actual market does work. And the way the actual market does work is it's responsive to laws that were passed in this country, actually, including, for example, the civil rights statutes that were passed in 1964. So maybe what you said, Luigi, is correct. And I can get behind this, and the old libertarian version of myself get behind the idea that the Jewish baker should be able to deny entry to somebody on the basis of their German heritage. Problem is, the United States laws don't permit him to make that judgment. In fact, the United States laws say that you can't discriminate against somebody on the basis of their race, their sex, their religion, or their national origin. And as the Supreme Court construed sex last year, that now includes sexual orientation. That is the law of the land in the United States. And the reality of the history of the corporation, especially the last 60 years of the history of the corporation in the United States, is that many of the corporate bureaucracies, what I call jokingly deep corporate as the counterpart to the deep state, what the deep corporate bureaucracy that emerged to administer these civil rights statutes became the very sources of the kind of political discrimination that we see today, that the bureaucracies that were designed to carry out the civil rights statutes. In the post-1964 version of the civil rights movement, you have now case law in this country that says that actually it may be a civil rights violations if you apply an intelligence test at the doorstep that has racially disparate outcomes. There's a case called Griggs versus Duke Power, I believe, that had a disparate impact theory wedded into the law that actually created bureaucracies and companies to make sure that their hiring processes did not result in racially disparate outcomes, which in turn then created the modern force of the anti-racist movement that those same corporations now implement, which then create the very conditions for the kind of political discrimination that we see today, which leads me to one of the solutions that I propose in the book to say that if we have protected classes at all on race and sex or religion or national origin, then we actually ought to, as a matter of public policy, apply those standards even-handedly and say that we all use that to protect political belief as well, or else we're creating this new cultural threat to the integrity of free speech and open debate and a democracy. Now, maybe there's a world in which we don't need those protected classes at all. I, for one, am not afraid to admit that I actually would be fine with repealing the protected classes in the civil rights statutes and let the beauty of free market capitalism work the way that Luigi laid out. I can get behind the idyllic vision. But that vision of that free market that we idealize doesn't exist today. And I don't mean this in any combative sense, but none of the proponents of that vision of free market capitalism have taken it up as their cause to repeal the civil rights statutes in this country because they happen to be so popular politically. And so we're left with the worst of all worlds, where actually legislation created the very conditions for the kind of political discrimination that we see today. The very bureaucracies that were created in the corporate sphere to carry out those legislative goals are perpetuating threats to democracy by stifling the open debate of ideas. And yet we're feigning the illusion that that's actually just a marketplace of ideas working in a free market, when in fact that free market was guided by the heavy hand of an Uncle Sam who acted 60 years ago. That's just one example. I actually put, if you trace it back further into the history of the corporation, I put the business judgment rule in part in this category. I put even the advent of limited liability and the cloak of limited liability being able to expand to protect more corporate behavior than was intended to be protected by limited liability as effective forms of state intervention that created the conditions for an actual unfree market that ultimately masquerades in the guise of a free market today. And I think that's a great conversation to have. Section 230, by the way, fits this description for me too. So I'll pause there, and I'd love to double click on some of that and go further, because I think that's at the heart of the debate that we actually need to be having in the modern moment, rather than the debate that Milton Friedman was having in theory back in 1970.
Professor, would you like to respond? Otherwise, I can go into the moderated questions.
I think for the sake of the debate, let's go to the moderated question. Otherwise, we keep going back and forth.
Wonderful. No, it's great. This is perfect. So the first question will be to you, Professor, and then we'll give Vivek a chance to respond with his own thoughts. So we know you've written a lot about sort of crony capitalism and its threats to democracy. Do you see that this woke economics or stakeholder capitalism could just be a crony capitalism 2.0 sort of in disguise, as it were?
As I said, I do see that large monopolistic corporations are becoming excessively powerful in the United States, and they are a threat to democracy in this country, and unfortunately not in a lot of other countries as well. I don't see that necessarily the woke component as the most dangerous component. I think is more like a distraction and a way to sort of appear in what is the expression, a wolf in lamb claws, or whatever is the expression in English. Is it sort of to hide your true nature through some camouflage that work quite well. But I think that I remain convinced of the idea that the major source of problem is precisely they have market power, because without market power, I can easily substitute. And this is an idea that is not original to me. Gary Becker was saying that, for example, in competition, you can destroy races pretty effectively, because the cost that you impose on racist organizations is going to be so large that they cannot survive in the long term. And this applies to races, applies to excessive anti-racists, apply to any sort of crazy ideas that people come up with. But again, the crucial point is that there is this threat to survival that monopolistic organizations don't, especially monopolistic organizations who are in bed with the government. And I think that that's where the Crony component is, and where the danger is.
And Vivek, if you'd like to respond.
I basically agree. That is definitely where the biggest danger rests today. But I don't want to belabor the point I made earlier. I think that actually, I'll make the point in a different way. Look, I think that the real issue that we have today with concentrated corporate power, let's just say in the sphere of large technology companies, is not that these companies are actually exercising the power of a product cartel. And I think that's different than the kinds of monopolies that we used to see in the 20th century or the 19th century, the kinds of monopolies that antitrust law in this country was born to ultimately police against, the kind where consumers were gouged on axes of price or consumer choice. This is part of the reason that many of the big tech CEOs run circles around congressmen every time they testify and they're hauled before an antitrust subcommittee or whatever. They point to the fact that many of their products are cheap, many of them are free, and there's certainly widespread competition and choice. But this is where I sort of depart by a hair with Professor Zingales, is that I ultimately think that the real problem in Silicon Valley isn't a product cartel, it is an ideological cartel, where even if we took those 4 large companies or 5 large companies or whatever they are, and break them up into 50 small companies, we would still have those 50 small companies adhering to the same ideological orthodoxy. In fact, we already see it today amongst startup companies, amongst venture capitalists, all demanding that their employees, the people who rise the ranks of their companies, the people who go from engineer to CEO, be it at Google or be it at Twitter, are the kinds of people who ultimately bend the knee and pledge fealty to one particular form of social orthodoxy. And I think that that's not a problem that antitrust law is going to solve. It's not a problem that we solve by ultimately creating a breakup of any one corporation. It's ultimately a product that exists in the culture of an entire industry that itself is able to wield cultural power that is somewhat orthogonal to the kind of corporate power that antitrust law was designed to police against. And if it were just the first problem, there's plenty of other people who have written about that I would have very little to have added to that conversation, certainly not enough to justify a book about it. But to put a fine point on it, part of the contribution of a book like the kind I wrote is to sort of revise some of the dogmas of antitrust law from the 20th century to be able to revisit what kind of corporate power we ought to find most bothersome today. And that's the kind of corporate power that's exercised, amplified and worsened, no doubt, and exacerbated by companies that exercise undue market power. But at the very core, the essence of the problem was not the concentration of the corporate power itself, but the adoption of a uniform ideological agenda spanning companies large and small and even across multiple industries, which is just a new kind of problem that I don't think we've sufficiently intellectualized in a way that hopefully yields promising solutions going forward.
Wonderful. Appreciate the Game of Thrones reference there as well. So, and in the interest of time, I'll skip ahead here, JR, to one of our later questions. So this question will be to you, Mr. Ramaswamy. As future business leaders, what advice would you give us entering the business world in this sort of environment? And then, of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, Professor, after you, Vivek.
Yeah. So I'm somewhat conflicted about the advice that I'm about to give you, because I believe it is highly likely, if followed, to make you commercially successful. I am less certain of whether, if followed, it is more likely to make America a stronger country at its core. But I think that there's a wide open opportunity right now for enterprising leaders, for entrepreneurs, to tap into the hunger and demand of, I think, about 70 plus million Americans who are hungry for brands and companies that they can do business with, who ultimately respect them for their own value, the values adopted by what I call the woke industrial complex today. Many companies in Wall Street, Big Pharma, Silicon Valley, much of large corporate America espousing a narrow orthodoxy that's actually shared only by a relatively small minority of the American populace. And one of the things that makes this a particularly compelling business opportunity is many of those 70 million people, and that's a conservative estimate, it may be even more than that, but many of those 70 million adults are the best customers you could imagine for a business. They tend to be, let's say people who find the following ideas resonant, that we're one nation under God, that the content of your character trumps the color of your skin, that capitalism is the best system known to mankind to lift people up out of poverty, and we won't apologize for it. Imagine a corporation just saying those things right now. None of the firms that recruit at your respective business schools, I will venture to say, are actually saying those things on their front door. They're going to say we stand for diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we believe in anti-racism, that we stand for the empowerment of X, Y, or Z disempowered community where X, Y, and Z are a really narrow conception of who counts as disempowered. These are the kinds of things they're saying in their social proclamations. They're not saying that we're one nation under God. They're not saying that the Bill of Rights is non-negotiable. They're not saying that capitalism is a system that we won't apologize for. I think that there's a wide open opportunity for businesses to ultimately seize that vacuum and say that anyone who finds those messages resonant tend to be some of the best customers of a business. They're net savers. They tend to be better insurance risks. They tend to be better credit risks. There's good data supporting the fact that if you've been married for a certain number of years, if you respond well to those messages, if you're a lawful gun owner, whatever, you actually make for a better customer of many businesses. And yet nobody's going after those best customers because of this weird cultural dislocation that's created an arbitrage, really, for I think many entrepreneurs across industries to be able to tap into. I say that I'm conflicted about it because I think such businesses would be successful commercially. I don't want to see two economies in this country personally. We already have a $1.7 billion public company that sells a right-wing version of coffee to respond to Starbucks as a left-wing version of coffee. That's Black Rifle Coffee, which just went public via SPAC this year. I think that once we get to a right-wing version of baseball and a left-wing version of baseball, that might be the beginning of the end of the American experiment as we know it. But I struggle with it because we're not starting from neutral territory either. And so if one of you did feel inspired to want to make that move, I wouldn't feel guilty about it. I'm personally conflicted about it, but I think that you can do so without qualms because you can also do so hoping that actually stealing 1 million customers from JP Morgan Chase or from a million users from Facebook or whatever has the effect of waking up those companies to say that, boy, did we screw that up over the last 10 years. We should depoliticize what we do as a way of competing along product axes rather than virtue axes, and restores a sense of depoliticization to our private sector, which would be a good way for this to play out rather than segregating our economy on partisan lines, which I think is an alternative way that it could play out too. So that would be a piece of advice for those of you who want to make money, and whether or not you want to make America a better country, you'd have to reflect on which path you think that's going to take us down.
And your response, Professor?
I think that I am more optimistic, and I believe that there are many ways to skin a cat, and there are many ways to succeed. And the beauty of the American dream is that you can create your own path. And you want to create a woke company that recite some stuff every day in the morning. You find your people, you do it. You want to create a super religious company that do the prayer every morning. You do it. I think that the beauty is let's try to give everybody an opportunity to develop their own enterprise, their own system with respect for others. But I think that I don't like this idea to say we should create the Republican coffee and the Democratic coffee. Also because I think that I don't see the world as neatly divided into two. I think there are cultural issues, there are economic issues, and there are a lot of people who voted for one and voted for the other. For Christ's sake, Iowa elected Obama with a huge majority and then went for Trump. So I think that this stigmatization that we must be one type or the other is really, really bad.
I agree with that, but let me just press you on the diversity point, because I think you are conflating, if I may, two different points that I think we ought to parse. One is the diversity of perspectives in our democracy. With this home state of Ohio, where I live, is just another one of those states. Went for Obama twice and went for Trump twice. It's where I'm talking to you all from today. That's not the point I'm making. I'm talking about the relative homogeneity in the group of people who wield corporate power today. And so again, I sort of, well, let's just say if there's a financial institution today on Wall Street that would say that we ultimately stand for the idea, I'm going to repeat some of the values I mentioned earlier, that we're one nation under God, that the Bill of Rights is non-negotiable, that we believe in the rule of law and stand with law enforcement, that the content of your character trumps the color of your skin, and that capitalism has lifted more people up out of poverty than any system known to mankind, and we're not going to apologize for any of those things. I think that brand would resonate with millions of Americans who feel excluded and disaffected from their economy. Yet from JP Morgan Chase to Bank of America to Goldman Sachs to American Express, there is one narrow orthodoxy that each of these institutions is pushing today, which is the fact that actually America is a systemically racist country, that we must adopt an anti-racist agenda, that we must apologize for the historical sins of capitalism, while actually reaping the benefits of it ourselves. That's the point I'm making, is that in the elite corridors of corporate America, populated with the C-suites and ranks from people who have been educated at universities that inculcate these same worldviews, there's a disconnect between the absence of diversity of thought in the highest ranks of at least expressed views of elite investors and C-suites of corporations versus the opportunity that actually exists to speak to many other ordinary consumers who are left behind by that. So that's the business opportunity that I say descriptively. Whether that's a good thing for America or not, I think is debatable. But I think that there's a third way forward, which is not to create the Republican version of coffee, which is effectively what Black Rifle did and happened to be commercially successful by doing it, but by purposefully actually restoring a sense of depoliticization of the private sector, to say that we don't stand for DEI, we stand for EOC, as I argue in the book, excellence, opportunity, and civility, that we think that diversity is important, but it's only important as a means to the end of achieving excellence. And I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican or Black or white, the thing that we pursue here is excellence in the products that we deliver, and that's all we care about. We actually dispense with social values, and if you want to buy a pair of sneakers with some social justice on the side, go to Nike or anywhere else. But if you want to just buy an excellent product that allows you to excel at what you want to do, you come here. I think there's my subjective assessment is that there is a wide open opportunity for an entrepreneur who's willing to defect from the orthodoxy of an elite peer group to be able to capture that opportunity that might lose some elite peer friends in the process, but will win a lot of consumers in the process. That was the point that I was making.
But again, this opportunity exists if the market is competitive. So if you go and ask for loans, and most of the banks are in the other category because imagine you want to get a bigger loan. There are not a lot of banks these days that can give you a bigger loans. And most of them are, as you said, part of a sort of mentality. So they're probably going to shun you away because of that idea. So that's exactly where the concentration leads to problems. In a competitive market, yes, you should defect and find your own niche, absolutely. But it's not easy today in many sectors.
All right, I just want to gauge the room for a second here. Professor and Mr. Ramaswamy, would you be able to go for another 15 minutes after the hour potentially?
Actually, no, because we actually have to tape the podcast after that, and it's already organized. So.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, since we only have about 5 minutes left, then I'll send it to JR for our final question here, and apologies to the audience for not getting to the Q&A. Just thought we were having a good back and forth there, but we can discuss after the speakers leave and potentially get those questions out to them if you're still interested in having your question answered.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I guess we actually have a couple of questions here for each Vivek and Luigi that were curated from students in Smith Society chapters. So I guess I'll start with one for Luigi. So Luigi, you mentioned that you were somewhat sympathetic to Vivek's proposal of limiting the scope of corporate liability to exclude kind of these actions that are in the political realm. I guess you and Oliver Hart have mentioned recently in some of your writings about this concept of shareholder democracy, like expanding the range of issues that shareholders can vote on Do you think that this would potentially be a solution to some of these issues that you and Vivek have talked about over the last 45 minutes or so?
I don't think it's necessarily a solution to the threat to corporate democracy, but I think that this is maybe for another meeting. I'm sympathetic to Vivek's idea that there are three types of wokeism, and the most interesting one is bottom-up. And he associates this bottom-up only with consumers. I think there is also a bottom-up for shareholders. And I see this as much more democratic, as a potential undermining both the managerialist and the large investors version of it. Because today, and here I am with what Vivek says, is Larry Fink decides how to invest my money, basically. And no, sorry, not only how to invest, how to vote my money.
Vote.
Yes, how to vote my money. And that is really, in my way, not correct, especially when he has particularly strong opinion, which, by the way, many times don't coincide with mine. So I am actually working with Oliver Hart, trying to find better ways to communicate, and to the credit of BlackRock, even BlackRock now is trying to find a way to transfer some of the voting power. Now, they're doing mostly with large investors, and what I would like to see is that small investors be in power in communicating not what each individual vote should be, because that's too much, but at least the direction of the vote. And to me, that would be one way to reduce this excessive managerial wokeism, because you let shareholders decide what they want to do. After all, it's their money, and if they want to burn their money for some initiatives they think is valuable, power to them.
All right, and I guess we have one final question for Vivek, if you have the time. You kind of mentioned this in your last set of remarks about this very sudden shift in the managerial class, their kind of behavior and attitudes toward these woke concepts. I guess this came up because I read a recent review of your book by Richard Hanania. I don't know if you've seen it. And I guess I'd like to ask a little bit more, if you have a theory by why this shift has occurred so quickly and so recently. Do you think it's just kind of the long march through institutions that have finally kind of reached its conclusion in the last few years? Or is it reflective of some sort of like passing fad? Like, what's your underlying theory for why this seems to have become such an issue recently?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you mentioned Richard Hanania's book review, which is a somewhat critical book review that was recently published, but I thought was excellent, actually, and arguably from the right. It's offering the ways in which actually I undersold the extent to which legislation in the United States actually played a role in creating the conditions for woke capitalism today. I don't agree with everything he said descriptively as a matter of history, but they're intellectually provocative points. And I actually think that I agree with many of them. It must have done a poor job of laying that out in the book. I think that the question of the suddenness of how it all happened, I think that's what it takes a book to parse, because there's no silver bullet explanation. I think there's a few factors at play. I think the 2008 financial crisis played a major role, where after the 2008 crisis, corporations were seen as the bad guys, what the old left wanted to do, and that was the political threat to corporate power. And generally speaking, what they wanted to do was exercise governmental control, redistribution. That's what the Occupy Wall Street movement at its core represented. The embrace of the new postmodern progressive woke values were really a way of defanging the Occupy Wall Street movement. It's pretty easy to applaud diversity and inclusion and put some token minorities on your boards. It's a lot harder to grapple with the demands of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And so this was effectively a way of dividing and conquering the left, getting in bed with the newly woke ascendant wing of the left by using that to put Occupy Wall Street up for adoption. I think that's a big part of the story. I think that takes place around the same time as, speaking to the bottom-up consumer-driven point that we were both talking about. We're also in the middle of the largest intergenerational wealth transfer in human history. And I think that in many ways, this has created a psychological need in an entire generation to ultimately grapple with the fact that they're on the receiving end of that intergenerational wealth transfer. Ludwig von Mises, I think, famously said a century ago that that anti-capitalism is born of a psychological need created by capitalism itself, by which he means that if you're a great man and the son of a great man, there's two ways to exceed your father. One is on his own terms, which is by definition hard to do. The other is actually through exhibiting moral superiority, which in some ways is easier to do because it's subjectively defined. Write that on a generational scale, and you ultimately have the woke demands of an entire generation of ultimately wanting to decry capitalism. And it fits the bill perfectly because it's not their fault they were born with white privilege. It was their ancestors' fault. So I think that there's a bottom-up generational shift that comes from a culture that has, in many ways lost the sources of identity that used to fill the moral hunger of a generation one at a time. Patriotism, faith, hard work, family, these concepts that used to fulfill our need for identity and purpose are on the decline. And at the same time, you have cynical interests on the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, for example, that allowed corporations to seize on that and prey on that moral hunger, like Virginia Slim's manufacturer might have preyed on the body image insecurity issues of a teenage girl in the 1990s. That's effectively what I think much of corporate America today is doing to the moral insecurities of an entire generation, really my generation that I'm speaking for there. So even that is an incomplete explanation, but it gives you a sense of how this complicated confluence of factors led to an otherwise acceleration of a fringe trend to become the dominant orthodoxy in corporate America.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Professor, do you have any parting comments before you have to hop off?
No, it was a pleasure, and thank you for organizing this.
I want one final shout out, self-interested here, is if there's I only want the really smart ones, but if there's really smart students or people who are aspiring and driven and hardworking students out there who found some of the ideas, especially in the creation of in the pursuit of opportunities in the new economy, in the manner that I laid out, not to go after the right-wing version, the alt version of banking or coffee or whatever, but to be able to do it in a way that pursued apolitical values like excellence or like the revival of alternative affirmative values that still addressed a vacuum that was left in the wake of a monolithic shift in the corporate culture of progressive orthodoxy. I'm actively working on many of those opportunities, investing in some of them, spawning others. And so if you find that intellectually appealing, but also have a hunger to sort of be a part of spawning new enterprises that could capture that opportunity, reach out to me. I'll just put my email in the chat right now, and and hopefully we'll get some good people out of that. That was one of my objectives for coming to this, is to get good students. So thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful. This is a discussion about capitalism, right? So I got to put out the marketplace of ideas. Well, Professor Zingales and Mr. Ramaswamy, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy evenings tonight to have this debate, this discussion on stakeholder and shareholder capitalism and some of these trends going on within our business world.